Hello everyone, welcome to my new weekly Luthercast. Each week I'm going to take a section of Martin Luther's large Catechism and just spend a little time reflecting on some of his thoughts. My goal, or at least one of them, is simply to give the on-the-go Christian just a moment of reflection in their day. I also hope that this serves as a safe place where theological discussion can take place. So please feel free to leave either a comment or a question or both down below. Finally, as I go through Luther's Catechism, I'll assume that the listener has no background in Lutheran theology or even Christianity for that matter. So again, please leave a comment if you have a question or I'm not clear enough. So for this first week, I'd like to examine how Martin Luther treats the first commandment. The first commandment is, you are to have no other God. So what does this mean? Luther's answer is this. He writes, we are to fear, love, and trust God above all things. This seems simple enough, right? Well, first, let's look at these three terms that Luther gives us. We're to fear, we're to love, and we're to trust God above all things. It's interesting that Luther uses the term fear to describe our relationship with God. And perhaps these are some of the hardest words that Luther writes to us. When Luther writes that we are to fear God, he really means it. He believes God isn't something to be messed with. But even despite this, Luther does not believe that being a Christian is to live in constant fear. Luther understands fear as the believer's willingness to give the highest place in our heart to God. And when we give this highest place in our heart to God, we're able to see God in a new light. God is not simply the punisher, but also He is a God that forgives us as well. And as such, Christians go about our lives in a relationship with God in a childlike manner. And it is this childlike manner because it's fear mixed with love. If we only live in fear, then we're simply slaves to God. And nobody wants that, right? But rather, we live in this duality because we know that God loves us as well. And we know that God loves us because God first loved us, and that God sent His Son for us so that we might be saved. Luther's explanation is interesting because we normally associate fear with cowering or being scared. I was bullied when I was younger. Fear is not something that I really like to think about. Luther's understands the term in this way, but it's more than this. Luther uses this term to also describe God's absolute majesty and to show how grand God really is. We're to fear God because God is absolute and God is beyond our understanding. Ultimately, we're left in awe. So moving on to the next term, Luther doesn't end his explanation with fear. The next term is love. Again, this term seems simple enough. We're to love God. But this love is a tricky thing. It's tricky because throughout our daily lives, there are multiple things that press themselves against us, and there are multiple things that vie for our affection and our love that are not God. This is what Luther calls false worship. If we're worshiping things that aren't God, well then we're not placing God first in our hearts, are we? So God asks that we love God, and we show this by living a godly life. More to this as we go along. And also, we show this by loving the things that God has given us. Lastly, God asks that God be the place where our absolute trust resides. And it's in this trust that we rely upon God to care for us and to give us all that we need, whether that be our daily bread, our health, or even courage to get throughout the day. We trust in God because God loves us, and we trust in God because God knows exactly what we need, and by giving ourselves over to God and not trusting in our own selves, in our own strength, we're truly free from worry. And that's some good news. So just to recap, the first commandment is we are to have no other God. And Luther explains that we are to fear, love, and trust God above all things. Basically, what God is forbidding in this commandment is idolatry. God is forbidding those things that take our attention away from God, however impossible it is to avoid those things. Now, I'm sure there's some questions that are coming up, and that's good. Please bring these questions up on the message board below. And really the beauty of Martin Luther's Catechism is that you kind of have to read all of it to really get all the answers. So frustrating and also beautiful in its own right. So in many ways this is an experiment, but I hope that you stick with me and you stick with this. And I thank you for watching my first post. So peace and blessings until next week. Goodbye.